All right, tonight's all about vermicomposting. Well, in general terms, it's this here. It's some sort of a container, some worms, some kitchen scraps, and your hands, and that's vermicomposting. And then we just take care of this pail until the worms turn the kitchen scraps into something we call compost. And we're going to have a closer look at what that means. That's the gist of it. Now, the nice thing about vermicomposting is that it's the one process that you can do in the home. You can do it all year long, pretty easy, and you usually do it in the basement somewhere, and it's relatively easy. And tonight we're going to go through and talk about what it really is and have a closer look at it. And then I'm going to give you the Coles Notes version of how to do it. Everything from finding your worms, different containers, how to take care of it, problems, and so on, all the way through. But we're only going to touch on a lot of those. As you know, I do have a book on composting, and there is more information available on this. But if you go through tonight's program, it'll give you everything you need to know to get started. Now, we think of vermicomposting as something we do in the home, and most of my comments tonight will be in that direction because I know most of you are interested in that. But vermicomposting is actually growing for outside and on farms and in larger situations. So you can do this big time, and you could have huge piles, particularly in Asia, not so much in the US, but in Asia, it's very common to do this outside. You basically had a big pile of manure, get your worms, do the vermicomposting outside, and you produce a lot of compost that way. It's also a commercial operation, and commercial facilities will use other types of containers that are quite large, and they basically run these all year long producing their product. It is of interest for those groups, but we're going to focus on home vermicomposting. So you get some sort of a container, you put in some kitchen scraps, you put in some what we call bedding, and shredded newspaper works perfect for that. Throw in the worms, and that's it. Feed them every once in a while. After a few months, you harvest the compost, and away you go. So it's a relatively simple thing. It doesn't need a lot of equipment to get started. You can use one of these Tupperware type things. You can build your own. You can buy fancy systems. Lots of variations there. Now, I might mention that the lid at the bottom here is to catch drippings. So this pail will have some holes in the bottom. And if liquid is created, that will catch that. A lot of people make these composts without creating that liquid. And in fact, some people say if you get the liquid, you're not doing it right. That's not really true, but it can be on the drier side, so the liquid isn't even a problem. So what is it? Well, quite honestly, it's pet care. And I think if you're thinking about this, you really need to think about this as taking care of worms, not so much the composting part. If you like to take care of worms, or you're willing to do that to get the compost, it is all about the worms. You have to learn how to take care of them. You're going to feed them. You're going to keep them happy with the right temperature, keep them with the right humidity, and so on. Take care of them when you're on holidays, all those sort of things. Now, the good thing about them is that you don't have to take them for a walk, though. So here's some pros and cons for vermicomposting. So the pros is that we can do this in any size of container. It can be as small as 1 cubic foot, or it can be as large as a whole barn outside. There's no turning. You don't have to worry about all these CN ratios that we talked about last week, right? We don't care about that sort of stuff. There is some evidence that vermicomposting retains more of the nitrogen than other types of composting. That's maybe not a big pro, but I think it's one that's rarely mentioned. And I think it is important because one of the reasons we're making this compost is to feed plants, and nitrogen is the nutrient they need the most. So keeping more in the compost is good for that reason. The second reason is that if nitrogen escapes from composting, it usually escapes as a gas, as nitrous oxide. And that's a greenhouse gas that's 20 or 30 times worse than CO2. So we want that nitrogen in the soil. We don't want it escaping as a gas. You can do it indoors. But there are some downsides. So it does require a bit more time than other types of composting. There is some expense here. You have to buy the worms. You have to make some sort of a container. Seeds are generally left alone by the worms, so they will be in the mix. You do have to go through a harvesting process, which is maybe the worst part. I mean, most people don't mind taking care of this thing, and then you get to the point where you have to harvest your casts. Oh, and by the way, casts, that's just a fancy name for a worm poop. It's more politically correct, so we call them casts. But you do have to harvest that, and then you have to do something with it. This is a good process for the stuff you create in the kitchen, your kitchen scraps. It's great for the plant material you get from your house plants and so on. But for most home use, it's not really great for large amounts of stuff that you might create in your garden. If you have a larger garden and you got lots of leaves and things in the fall, you either have to go and build very large vermicompost containers, or you have to do that a different way. So the quantity of material here is relatively small compared to, say, the large bins that we talked about last week. All right, so I'm going to come back to this question of what is this, because this is very confusing to people. And a lot of what you'll read about vermicomposting in other places, and particularly online, is actually wrong. So most people think that what we end up with here is a whole bunch of worm poop, a whole bunch of casts or vermicasts. And that's not really true. It may surprise you to know that we're not really sure what you end up with here. And I'll come back to that in a second. But here's the general process. So day 0, we start the bin. We put some worms in, we put some food in. This goes on for 4 to 6 months. And then we harvest the casts. We can use that immediately if we do it outside and use it in the garden, or if we're going to use this for house plants, we probably want to age it for another 2 months. Remember, all this composting process is slow, and we do want that compost process to continue until it's aged enough so it's not going to harm our plants. And that's why for indoor use is aged a little longer. But you can see we're looking at, half a year for one of these batches to take place. So it's a reasonable amount of time. Let's ask a few basic questions. It's called vermicompost. Is it compost? And the answer is not really. This is not compost like you get out of a compost bin. What you have here is the vermicasts are produced and they are partially decomposed, but they're not fully decomposed. In this process, there's no such thing as complete compost, finished compost. So those terms are used somewhere else. In this case, we don't have that. And here's why. Think about this bin. On day 0, I put my worms in. They take a little nibble of something, and they poop out a few casts here. Those sit in that bucket now for 4 to 6 months, so they're old. But the day before you harvest, you get some fresh stuff. I mean, these things are only a day old, so they haven't had time to compost yet. So we get a mixture of things. We get a mixture of very fresh stuff and older composted stuff. Now, a lot of people think that the worms are doing the composting, and that's not true. There's very little composting actually takes place inside the worm. Now, if you want to know more about this process, my book's on the left there, Compost Science for Gardeners. The other book you might look at is this one by Rhonda Sherman, The Worm Farmer's Handbook. This book is more designed for larger operations. It's not really a home use book, but I wanted to put that up there because Rhonda Sherman is North America and maybe the world's leader in vermicompost research. And we actually had her as a guest speaker last year as part of the Guelph seminars. And I had a chance to talk to her about some questions I had that I couldn't get answered anywhere else. And so some of the information I'm presenting comes from her. And she actually researches worms and worm poop. That's her work. And she is a university professor and she does some really good work. So that's another book you certainly could consider. So let's look at some of this information that's floating around. I see all kinds of people thinking that vermicompost is somewhat superior to all other kinds of compost. And it really isn't. I haven't been able to find any reason why vermicompost is better than any other types of compost. It's just a way of taking organic material and turning it into something that plants can use. I see a lot of claims that say vermicompost is full of beneficial microbes, and we add these to the soil when we add the vermicompost to soil. That's not really true. I mean, it's not even true for regular compost. Both of those have microbes in them, but when we add it to soil, we're not really adding a lot to soil because soil already is full of these. What we are adding to soil is decomposed organic matter, and that's food for microbes. And so the microbes that are naturally in soil, they start to grow. This business of beneficial, we have to be careful with that word. Okay, the gardener has no idea whether these microbes are beneficial or not. And yet I see that all the time, that option A gives you beneficial ones and option B doesn't. And we don't know. We don't even know what microbes are in there. We just know there's microbes, and some are beneficial and some are not. Some are pathogens. Vermicompost stimulates root growth. That's not true either, unless your soil is deficient in phosphate. And we're going to have a look at that later. I'm going to look at the NPK of vermicompost and compare it to regular compost. The last one on the list there I added because it's just come up in the last week or two, and something that we've been discussing on our Facebook group. So there are lots of claims out there that vermicompost is very rich in something called chitinase. This is an enzyme that dissolves chitin. And chitin is the material that makes up the hard shell of some insects. So things like beetles, for instance, right? So the enzyme digests the outer layer of the beetles. And people are claiming, well, vermicompost has high amounts of this. And when we put it on soil, plants absorb it. And because they absorb it, when the beetle comes and eats the leaves, they die from this stuff. Well, I did some research on this, and it turns out that some of this is sort of true, but this enzyme is found everywhere. Plants make it themselves. They don't need to get it from soil. There's no evidence that worms or vermicompost has high amounts of this. And there's certainly no evidence that plants actually absorb it from the soil. So most of this is all made up stuff. But I find lots of myths about vermicompost. It is good compost, but it's not magical compost. All right, as I said before, this whole process is all about worms. These are our pets, so let's understand them a little bit. This is a cross-section of a worm, an earthworm. They're pretty simple animals. It's basically a long tube. Stuff goes in the mouth, and it passes along until it comes out the other end. And there's a crop in there and a gizzard where a lot of digesting happens, and then there's an intestine where nutrients are absorbed. But the digestive system of worms is pretty basic. There's very little that actually happens. So food comes in the front end, and they actually have little stones, little bits of sand in their crop and gizzard, and they help grind up this material. So the worm pulverizes the material and makes it into small pieces. The other thing that you find in the worm is a very high concentration of bacteria and other microbes as well, but mostly bacteria. And so the worm is actually taking care of these bacteria. And this also happens in animals, for instance. In our intestine system, we have lots of bacteria in there, and they're helping with the digestion process. But before that, we have a stomach that adds acids and digests the food. Worms don't have that. So what actually happens is that there's very little digestion that takes place. The worms grind up the material. There's a bit of digestion caused by the bacteria, and then it comes out the worm. So when the worm makes these casts, basically starting the composting process, almost no composting takes place inside the worm. It all happens afterwards. What the worm does, it grinds up the material, adds a lot of bacteria to it, and then spits it out the back end, and it's ready to start composting. And that's one of the reasons why saying this is a composting process isn't actually true. Well, let's talk about worm sex. So worms are hermaphrodites. And what that means is that they have both sexes. They're both male and female. And all worms, at least the ones we're talking about here, are hermaphrodites. But they can't have sex by themselves. They need a partner. So two worms will come together, And you might have noticed on earthworms and dewworms, they have this area that's a little rounder and bigger, and that's called the clitellum. And you might guess what that's for. That's part of this process. So both worms produce sperm and they exchange sperm with each other, and then they separate and then they go off their merry way. And each worm creates babies. But first, it actually makes eggs. It doesn't have live babies. And a lot of people see this in soil. They're reasonably large, and you can see them even in the garden. And they say, oh, these are worm eggs. And that's not really true. They're actually more like cocoons. So inside this structure is a whole bunch of eggs. And the worm lays this, adds sperm to it, they get fertilized. And if conditions are really good, the baby worms hatch out in about 2 weeks. But if conditions aren't right, this can take much longer. So if it's too dry, there isn't enough moisture, the temperature isn't correct, and so on, these things could sit for weeks and weeks and weeks and nothing happens. And then when the conditions are right, the worms come out. So this is one way you can actually tell that your worm bin's working really well. If you started it, say, let's say 4 weeks ago, you should start seeing baby worms and you should start seeing these cocoons, and that's saying, hey, everything's going well. These worms are happy, they're eating, they're growing, they're reproducing, and that's what you really want to see. These worms will be adults about 6 weeks after they hatch out, and then they start the whole process over again. In theory, you could make these worm bins with any worms that you happen to find, but it works best if we select certain types of worms. And the reason is that different types of worms like different temperature conditions, and they like to burrow different depths in the soil. So a lot of our garden worms like to be cooler and would find our home too warm. They wouldn't be happy there. The second problem is our garden worms like to dig deep in the soil, and we don't want that in a worm bin. We're only going to give them a couple inches, and we want them to kind of stay around the food. And when they're finished eating, we want them to go down 2 or 3 inches. We don't want them trying to dig 4 feet deep. There are certain worms that are perfect for this, and the most common one is sometimes called the manure worm or the red worm. But when you go to get your worms, particularly if you're going to buy them, look for that scientific name, okay? Because red worm is used for all kinds of different worms. You want to know that you're getting the right species there. Now, there are 2 or 3 other species that you could use, but I'd say 80% of the people doing vermicomposting use this species, so I would stick with it. All right, well, where do you get these worms? Well, you can buy them. And in fact, as I was preparing this a couple of days ago, I did a Kijiji check to see what Kijiji had available locally, and I couldn't find any homeowners selling worms, but I did find some commercial people that sell them in the area. And certainly in the US and online, you'll find other vendors of this. This is actually a fairly good market, I think. When you go to buy these, you want about a pound of worms, which works out to about 1,000 actual worms. And those are good for a bin that's about 1 square foot in size. Now, remember, your worms are going to start reproducing and growing, and in no time at all, you'll have a lot more than 1,000. So ideally, your bin starts out a little bigger than that, or they're going to get too crowded. The best place to get these is really from another person who already has some. If someone's had this bin going for 6 months to a year, they have too many worms. They don't know what to do with them. And they'll sell you some or give you some. And that's probably the easiest and best way to get them. That way you can drive across town, have a look at them, get them from your friend, bring them home, and away you go. Shipping them is always a bit of a problem because if it takes too long or gets too hot or it's too cold, then they arrive dead. So that's no good either. So try and find them locally. All right, you've got some worms. Now you got to put them somewhere. So they need a home. Lots of choices here. And I think if this is your first try at this, stay small, use something simple. You can get one of these totes, drill some holes in it for air exchange, and away you go, and you can give it a try. If you decide in 6 months you're not interested, no problem. You haven't spent a lot of money. On the other hand, if you get really involved in this, there are better options. Here's another one I found online, and these are different types of tubs, and someone's put holes in the bottom, and they're stacked, and you'll notice a little tap there. And we'll talk about why you want these things later. Here's a commercial one that's really nice. And again, you see that tap at the bottom, and then it's stacked. You have several layers in here. That will make harvesting easier later on. Here's a beautiful home-built one. Again, it's stacked and has different layers, and it has a tray at the bottom in case you get some drippings. And this is a good idea. It's a long box. And again, when we talk about harvesting, it'll make a lot of sense why this is a good choice. Anyways, the worms don't really care. What they want is a place in your home that's a little on the cool side. So basements work better than upstairs because they're usually cooler. They also want it dark, and that's why basements work better too. Worms don't really like the light. You've got worms, you've got a place for them to live. You're now a farmer, and it's time to farm these worms. First thing we need is some bedding. So we want something in there for them to live in. And here's the things we want to look for. It should hold moisture. One thing about worms is that they need to stay moist or they dry out. And they also breathe through their skin. And in order for them to breathe through their skin, the skin always has to be wet. That's one of the reasons worms out in the garden make slime. They need to keep moisture on them all the time. And if they're crawling along something that's drier, that slime protects them. We have the same situation here, but we want their bedding to be moist. So we're looking for something that holds that water. We want quite a bit of air in there. This isn't a pond that we're making, so more air than anything else. And we want something that has a high CN ratio. And we'll look at a few examples here. Lots of people use shredded newspaper. It may be the best option here. Of course, fewer and fewer people are getting newspapers, so they can actually be hard to find. Some people use cardboard, and they rip up cardboard into little pieces, and that works just as well as the newspaper. Some other options are fall leaves, which work really great. So you could collect them in the fall and then store them somewhere outside, bring some in every few months and use that for your bedding. Core is available, and core is shredded coconut husks. It's rather expensive around here, so it may not be the best option, but it works well. It's just kind of an expensive option. Peat moss is much less expensive around here because Canada has lots of peat moss available naturally, and there are companies that are harvesting it, and you can buy it in larger bales. Peat moss works well. You can use almost anything that meets the requirements that we set, right? So some people use sawdust, some people use wood chips, some people mix all these things together, so a little of this and a little of that. What's important for the worms is that they have lots of air in there, they have a reasonable amount of moisture in there, and they can eat the material you put in there. Okay, this is like a safety food. So if they've eaten all the good stuff you give them, they will eat this paper, and they will eat cardboard, and they'll eat peat moss and so on. And that will keep them alive until you get back to feeding them. Okay, so it has a dual purpose there. Here's how you start the worm bin. You get your container ready. You put in about 4 inches of your selected bedding material. You dump your worms in, and then keep the lid off and put a light above them. So when they're first introduced into your container, you have a couple issues. One is that they've just been shipped or moved and they're not very happy. And the first thing they want to do is crawl all over the place, and they'll try to crawl out of this container, but they don't like light. So if we put a light above it, then they'll go down into the material. They won't crawl out. And lots of people will leave the light on for 2 or 3 days until the worms get accustomed to their new home. Once you've done that, then we make it darker because they're going to stay there. They're not crawling out of this container unless there's a problem in the container. Okay, if it gets too dry, then they'll crawl out looking for another home. There's not enough food, they might come out looking for it. But as long as you take care of them, they'll stay in the container, and having worms crawl all over the basement isn't really an issue. For the first week, don't feed them because these worms are sensitive and they just need to get accustomed to their new home. Once you start feeding them, put in a very small amount, and it should disappear in a day. And if it's gone in a day, well, you give them twice as much tomorrow. But start feeding slowly. The worms don't have to eat all the time, and if they're really hungry, they'll start eating the bedding. That's why it's there. That's their emergency food. So don't overfeed them. In fact, when you go on holidays, if it's 2 or 3 weeks, just leave them. put in a bit of food. They'll take them for about a week, and then they'll eat bedding for the next week or two. They'll be fine like that. Right? How often do you feed them? Well, that's kind of up to you. There are people that feed every day. There's other people that do it once a week. Probably every 2 or 3 days works out quite well. And when you feed, what you want to do is put in only enough food that's going to be eaten in a couple days. You generally do is go in, find the food you put in last time and see if it's still there. If it's still there, then maybe don't add any more because they haven't finished their meal. If it's gone, well, maybe put in a little bit extra because you're not feeding them enough. Now, that's not entirely true because worms like certain foods more than others, and they don't like them too fresh. So if you put in, for instance, cucumber rinds, they're kind of tough. So the worms will ignore them for a few days and they'll let the microbes and the bacteria slowly digest them and mush them up a bit. And then the worms will come and eat them. So if things are hard to digest for them, they'll just leave them for a bit. So just because they don't come rushing out to eat it doesn't mean they don't like it. Once you put a bit of food in, cover it with a little bit of bedding. They prefer to eat in the dark, and they don't want to be sitting on top of the bedding, really. They prefer to be down a little bit. And that's it. Close it back up, come back in 2 or 3 days, and feed them some more. So how do you know your worms are happy? Well, if you open the lid and shine a light on them, they should dive. Okay, they should be pretty active. If they're not eating, then they're not very happy either. And then you have to figure out what the problem there is. So what do we feed these? Well, you can feed them pretty much anything that's organic. Now, a lot of people will stay away from eggs, meat, and dairy just because they start to smell after a couple days, and people will prefer not to have that. But the worms will eat those things. So you might put in just enough dairy or egg so that it's gone by the end of the day, then smelling isn't a problem. They typically don't like seeds. The seeds inside tomatoes or inside a melon, they'll just leave those. They don't like spicy food, so stay away from things that you've cooked that is very spicy. Stay away from things like hot peppers. They will pretty much ignore those. Salty food they probably will eat, but it's not necessarily good for them, so don't throw in a whole jar of pickles at one time. But a little bit of salt that you had on your plate and you have some scraps from that, that's okay. That's not going to harm them. A lot of people say don't give them citrus, and that's not really true. They don't like citrus usually, but they will learn to love it. So if you want to feed them citrus, give them a little bit and watch what they do. Once they get accustomed to it, they actually seem to like it. The other problem with citrus is that we generally eat the good stuff that's inside. So we eat the inside of the orange and we give them the shell, right? The skin on the outside. And that's pretty tough. So a lot of people put in some orange skins and leave them in there for a couple of days and say, oh, the worms aren't eating them. They don't like them. The worms aren't eating them because they're too tough. If they're in there for a week and they get all moldy and mushy, then the worms love them. So you have to give some of that stuff time to compost in there. Cornmeal is a really good, inexpensive food that you can buy. So if there are times you think you're not going to have any food for them or you're not generating enough kitchen scraps for them, you can always feed them cornmeal. Some general care things. Whenever you open the container, do the sniff test. Okay, this should smell pretty nice, like a wet forest after a rain, like a good smelling soil. If it doesn't smell like that, you have a problem. Okay, if it smells rotten, then either you put food in there that's rotting and they're not eating it, or the worms are dying and they're rotting. So do a sniff test. If it doesn't smell good, then you got to figure out what you're doing wrong. You can shine a light in there. And again, they should move fairly quickly. Make sure the moisture level's right. So if you take a handful of this stuff and squeeze it, it should feel wet, but should not have any dripping water out of it. That's the right moisture level. Leachate, we can talk about. Depending on the moisture level in this container and how it's built and how many air holes you have and so on, it can get on the wet side. And when that happens, the moisture runs to the bottom and runs down to the bottom of the container and out that spout. And that's why the spout's there. You don't want liquid in the bottom of these containers. And if you start having that, you want to drain that every couple of days because that leachate will start to smell and you want to get it out of there. Now, you can use that leachate in the garden or you can use it for watering your houseplants. It's got nutrients in there. There's nothing wrong with using it, but you don't want the beds too wet. And that's why it's nice to have one of these with a tap at the bottom so that that's easy to do. However, most people that do vermicomposting say you shouldn't get leachate anyways. If you have that, then you're putting in too much moisture, or you're feeding food that's too wet, and so on. So most people don't even have an issue with that if they're a little more careful in how they're taking care of their bins. And if it gets too wet, the other thing you can do is throw in some more bedding. Remember, the bedding absorbs that liquid and will tend to lower the moisture level. At all times, you want about 50% bedding in this mixture. And if the worms start eating the bedding and they start making a lot of vermicasts, then you throw in some more bedding. So kind of have a look at it, and it's hard to judge really, but kind of figure, okay, about half of it is still bedding. So that's okay. If it starts getting less than that, throw in a little extra, and you want to keep adding some fresh bedding into this mixture. All right, so we've been doing this for 4 or 6 months. It's time to do some harvesting. How do we do this? And there's many different ways. This is the easiest way, but some of you are going to think this is really cruel. So we now have this bin. It's half full of worm casts and has some bedding in there. And about a week ago, we stopped feeding them, so we don't have any old food in there. But we have lots of worms. They're reproducing, and we got more and more of them. One way to do is just take half of the material and dump it in the garden somewhere. Worms, casts, food, bedding, whatever, throw it in the garden. Now, those worms will survive for a little while outside. They can't take the winter cold we have in zone 5. So unless you're in a warm climate, they will get killed in the winter time. But that just adds more nutrients to the soil. Some people will think that's cruel and they don't want to do that. But consider this, worms reproduce fairly rapidly. And if you're doing a good job, you're going to have so many worms, you got to do something with them. So unless you have a lot of friends who want to do vermicomposting, or you're going to go in the business of selling worms, you got to get rid of them somehow. And one way is just to let them go in the garden, or start fishing hobby too. That would work. So this is the easiest way. This is another way, and it works really well. We talked about this long bed. So the way you use this bed is that you keep all your bedding and all the food and everything on one side. So let's say we put it in on the left side, and it's in there for 2 or 3 months. And then what we do is we stop feeding the left side. And by the way, that middle divider, it has some wire on it with holes where the worms can crawl through. So then we put bedding on the right side, and we put the food on the right side. And what happens? Well, the worms are pretty smart. They'll find the food. So they all crawl from the left side to the right side. And after 3 or 4 days, the left side has no worms, and you can just take all that material out and use it somehow. Right now, you've got them separated. You've got the worms separated from the casts. And then 4 to 6 months later, you do it the opposite way and move them back to the left. And that's one of the beauties of this container. In fact, what commercial businesses do, they have long beds, and they start them at one end of the bed, and they make a big pile of worms and throw on a bunch of food. And commercial places usually use manure. Worms love manure, but of course, manure is not so great food for the house. And then what they do is the next time they feed them, instead of putting it on top of the worms, they put it next to the worms, and the worms crawl into the manure. And then the next feeding goes next to them, and so on. So they slowly move the worms down this long bench because of where they place the food. And then the beginning part is now just clean vermicompost with no worms in it. This sort of system works well too. You can see the tap at the bottom to take out any leachate in case you get some. And the reason we have stacks like this is you start with the lower stack, and you put your worms and your bedding in there, and you feed them for a while in there. And then once that section gets pretty full of worm casts, what you do is you stop feeding that section. You then put some bedding in the upper one, and you put the food in the upper one. And the worms will crawl up to find the food. And then we go to the third one and to the fourth one. So after a period of time, we have all the worms in the top layer, and all the other layers are aged vermicompost. And again, very simple to separate them out. Some people don't bother with any of that, and they sift it and pull out all the worms and start a new bin. And that works too, but it's a lot more work. Here's another simple way. Put a light above them and leave that for 15-20 minutes. All the worms will go to the bottom of the bin, and then you scrape away the top 2 or 3 inches of vermicasts. Take that away. Leave the light for another 15 minutes to make sure the worms go even deeper, and then you scrape away another few inches and take that away. And once you're down to the bottom 3-4 inches, you put in a whole bunch of new bedding and start all over again. All right, well, what about this aging process? So what people recommend is that you can use the material as soon as you harvest it if you put it in the garden, because you generally will either dig it in and then plant later, or you use it as a mulch and you just put it on top. And so even if this compost material is a bit on the fresh side, it won't hurt the plant roots. There isn't enough nutrients in this to really damage them. If you're using it for house plants or inside containers, then it's good to take this and just age it for a couple months. Just like other types of compost, we want this compost to be well aged before we get it in contact with the plant roots. And so people will simply put it in containers or jars or something and just let it sit for several months. Some people will dry it out, and once it's dry, they store it for years. That's probably not necessary, and when you dry it out, you'll also lose a lot of the microbes in there, so it probably isn't the best way to do it, unless you're just generating so much you don't know what to do with it. Or maybe you're doing this in winter and you're creating lots in the winter and you don't want to use it right away, but you want to save it for your garden in the spring. Then you can just dry it out. And once it's dry, it has no odor, it doesn't mold up or anything. You can just put it in pretty much any kind of container. So what is the nutrient value of vermicompost? This data is actually pretty hard to find, but I did find someone who studied this in Holland, I believe. And they went around and collected kitchen scraps from schools and I think some factories. They took it, divided it up, and then treated it 2 different ways, either hot composting or vermicomposting. And then they did a chemical analysis to compare the two, and they came out with these numbers. Now, the actual numbers do depend on what you put in the bin, right? Depends on what you feed them. So it's going to vary, but this gives you a rough idea of what the numbers will look like. And you can see the nitrogen there is pretty much the same in the two systems, 1.4, 1.8. If we look at the third number, that's the potassium, they're actually identical. Where it's different is in the middle number. And vermicompost has more phosphate than regular compost. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But it turns out that the biology of the worms is such that they don't like a lot of phosphate. And they actually excrete the excess phosphate into their intestine system. So what comes out of the worm has more phosphate than you'd expect because the worms are trying to get rid of it. They get too much of this. Typically, you have 3 to 4 times as much phosphate in vermicompost. And that's why I said earlier that if you put this in soil that has a phosphate deficiency, vermicompost would be a good thing to add because it adds that extra phosphate. And then you might see more root growth, for instance. However, most soil in North America has enough phosphate, and we don't have to worry about it. So this extra phosphate isn't really a benefit in that case. Even in house plants and so on, when we're fertilizing, they don't need a high level of phosphate. Typically, plants need a ratio of 3:1:2. Vermicompost actually has too much phosphate for most plants. It's actually not a great thing unless you're very deficient in your soil. Another thing that becomes very popular is making vermicompost tea. And what you do is you take your casts and you put it in a bucket, and compost tea and vermicompost tea and weed tea, they're all essentially the same thing. There really isn't any difference, although other people will disagree with that and claim one is much better than the other. What you're doing in all 3 cases is you're taking some organic matter and you're putting it in water and you're brewing it. Now you can brew it with oxygen or without oxygen. People make big claims about which one's better, but the reality is that it really doesn't make a lot of difference. What we're doing here is we're adding nutrients to the water and we're adding a lot of microbes to the water. And then we use that to water plants or to even spray the leaves and so on. Lots of people think this is a great idea, but it turns out that the science disagrees. You're not going to create nutrients this way. Whatever nutrients were in the compost are in the water and the compost together. And in fact, most of the nutrients are actually in the bottom of the pail where the solid stuff is. You cannot create nutrients by this kind of a process. Now, you might speed up the decomposition a little bit, but usually these are only brewed for a couple days, so you're really not speeding much up. So you're not getting more nutrients. The other argument is that you're creating more microbes. And you do see an increase in microbes in this pail. The problem is that when science looks at taking these extra microbes and putting it on your soil, it doesn't result in higher microbes in the soil. The problem with a lot of research that shows positive results, they compare this to water. And sure, if I take this stuff and water my plants, and beside it I have a similar plant and I use water, the water is not going to work as well because this has nutrients in it. But when you find studies that compare compost to compost tea or vermicompost tea, you don't really see much of an improvement. So don't bother making tea. Save yourself some time. So if you want to get in touch with me, I can be found with the handle Garden Fundamentals. I have a YouTube channel, a blog, and a Facebook group. And if you come to our Facebook group to ask questions, we'll make sure that you get the right answer, unlike a lot of Facebook groups. Now, if you're interested in vermicompost, there are some Facebook groups that are dedicated to vermicomposting. You get lots of information there. Difficulty is knowing if the information you're getting is hype or whether it's real. But there are certainly groups out there that specialize in this type of composting. And that's tonight's program, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have on this or any other gardening questions. All right, what do you do if you have too many worms in the winter? Well, that's a bit of a problem. Lasagna is good, and you can always use them for that. If you're successful with this, you will have more and more worms. You have to get rid of them somehow. So you then go on Kijiji and start giving them away, or you start a little business and start selling them. They're not inexpensive, so they're like $40, I think, for 1,000 worms. So you can probably sell them to people for 20 and make some money. Or you give them away to friends, or worst case scenario, you put them outside. If you do that in the winter, they will die, but they will be added to the garden. I don't know what else you would do with them. You have to find someone who wants them. Are these native to Canada? I'm not certain of that. I think so. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is that they're called manure worms because they're readily found in manure that's sitting around. So in theory, you don't have to go and buy them. You just find a farmer with a pile of manure and dig away until you find enough. But it seems like most people actually just go and buy them. I mean, finding 1,000 of these guys to start a little farm is a lot of work. But I think they are, and I think they're actually native to a great part of the world. They're a very common worm. Someone said, I read they are native to Europe. Well, let me. You may be correct. Let's back up a little bit here. When you say, are they native to Canada? It sort of depends how you ask the question. There are no earthworms native to Canada. All right, so all the worms that were here before the last glacial ice age were killed off. And when the ice receded, we had no earthworms in Canada. But they have come back from the southern states where they survived, and they've traveled north, and people move them around. So all the earthworms that we have in Canada, in fact, are not native. When you asked the question, I was thinking, do they exist in the woods around here? And I think the answer is yes, but you're absolutely correct. They're not native to Canada. So how can they be common to Canada if they don't survive the winters? What these worms will do is not burrow very deep. So if they find a place where they're warm enough, then they'll survive. If you take your bin and try to do it in the garden, so we have a bin out there, they will freeze because above ground they get too cold. And if you take them out in the winter and sort of dump them somewhere, they'll die because they haven't got a home. So what our earthworm do in the fall is they start burrowing deeper and deeper. And some of them go down 3 or 4 feet and they spend the winter down there where it's warm enough. This particular type of worm will only go down maybe 6 inches to a foot, but provided they're in a protected area that stays a little warmer, they will survive that winter. So the one downside to vermicomposting in zone 5 is that it's, as a gardener at least, it's very hard to do outside over the winter. Some people actually take their bins outside in the summer and run them out there, but it's very hard to keep them over winter. You'd have to build a shelter for them. You may have to provide a little bit of heat on the coldest nights. They will survive pretty close to freezing, but it's a difficult way to do it. You're better off just leaving them in the house. Now, if you're doing this on a larger scale, then people will build little huts for them. They'll make sure in the fall they put in a lot of fresh manure, and that fresh manure produces heat, so it keeps the area warmer. They can live outside in our climate if you have larger containers and larger piles, or provide some supplemental heating.